The sun was setting over Pine Creek County as Police Sheriff Dan Turner adjusted his fake beard in the rearview mirror of his beat-up 1998 Chevrolet. 6 months of undercover work had transformed him from a clean-cut law enforcement official into someone his own mother wouldn't recognize. His once-pressed uniforms had been replaced by worn-out flannel shirts and faded jeans, and his usually well-maintained police cruiser traded for this rust bucket that backfired every time he hit the brakes. But that's exactly what he needed for this operation. The old car had become his second home during this investigation. Empty coffee cups littered the passenger seat floor, and fast food wrappers crinkled under his feet, all part of maintaining his cover as just another down-on-his-luck guy hanging around the rougher parts of town. The car's trunk, though, held something far more valuable: 6 months' worth of detailed notes, surveillance equipment, and evidence that could bring down one of the largest drug operations the state had ever seen. Dunn reached for his thermos, taking a long sip of cold coffee as he watched people come and go from the abandoned warehouse across the street. He'd been tracking the pattern of suspicious vehicles for weeks now: expensive SUVs pulling up at odd hours, staying for exactly 7 minutes, then leaving with different drivers than they arrived with. Tonight was no different, except for the nervous energy in the air. His radio crackled softly with chatter from the local police frequency. He kept it on low volume, more out of habit than necessity. After 20 years on the force, the background noise of dispatch calls felt as natural as breathing. What he didn't know was that his regular presence in the neighborhood hadn't gone unnoticed by the local police department. The sun had fully set when he noticed a black and white patrol car cruising past for the third time that evening. Dunn shifted in his seat, keeping his head down while maintaining a clear view through his side mirror. Something felt different about tonight. The patrol car was moving slower than usual, its occupants paying far too much attention to his vehicle. He'd been careful to maintain his cover, parking in different spots, never staying too long in one place, and always having a reasonable excuse ready if questioned. But law enforcement instincts worked both ways. Just as he could spot suspicious behavior, other cops could spot something that seemed out of place. And right now, he was that something. Dan's fingers drummed against the steering wheel as he considered his options. Moving now would look suspicious, but staying put might force a confrontation he wasn't ready for. His investigation was at a crucial point. Tomorrow's meeting could provide the final piece of evidence needed to bring down the entire operation. He couldn't risk blowing his cover now, not when he was so close. The weight of his real badge, hidden in his boot, felt heavier than usual. He'd worn it there every day of the operation, a constant reminder of who he really was and what he was fighting for. But revealing his identity too soon could destroy months of work and put countless lives at risk. The drug ring he was investigating had already been responsible for 12 overdoses in the county, 3 of them fatal. Through his mirror, Dan watched the patrol car make another pass, this time even slower. He could make out 2 officers inside, both young, probably new to the force. The kind of officers eager to make their mark, to prove themselves with a big bust. Under different circumstances, he would have admired their dedication. Tonight, though, their enthusiasm could destroy everything he'd worked for. The patrol car's lights suddenly flipped on, casting red and blue reflections across the surrounding buildings. Dan's heart rate picked up, but his face remained calm. This was the moment where his acting skills would really be put to the test. As the patrol car pulled up behind him, he slouched further in his seat, adopting the wary posture of someone used to unwanted police attention. Through his mirror, he watched the 2 officers step out of their vehicle, hands resting casually near their weapons. Their approaching footsteps echoed off the brick buildings, mixing with the distant sound of traffic and the hum of street lights. Dan took another sip of his cold coffee, playing the role of someone trying to appear unconcerned while every instinct screamed at him to reveal his true identity. This was just the beginning of what would become one of the most bizarre nights in Pine Creek County's law enforcement history. Neither the approaching officers nor Sheriff Dan Turner could have predicted how the next few hours would unfold, or how their actions would eventually change police procedure across the entire state. A sharp tap on his window shattered the tension. "Sir, roll down your window," came the authoritative voice from outside. Dan knew the next few minutes would determine whether his 6-month operation would succeed or go up in flames. Little did he know, up in flames, would turn out to be more than just a figure of speech. The young officers, Officer Lee and Officer Wilson, had been watching the suspicious Chevrolet for weeks now. Every night, same car, same spot, same scruffy-looking man inside. To them, it all added up to one thing. They were looking at a potential drug dealer's surveillance post. They'd seen enough crime shows and training videos to recognize the pattern, or so they thought. "Evening, sir," Officer Lee said, shining his flashlight through the now open window. The beam caught the collection of coffee cups, the worn-out dashboard, and Dan's carefully cultivated scruff. "We've noticed you spending a lot of time in this area. Mind telling us what brings you here?" Dan kept his posture slouched, his voice gravelly from months of practice. "Just trying to stay warm, officer. Car's my home these days." It wasn't entirely a lie. He had spent more nights in this car than in his own bed lately. Officer Wilson circled the vehicle, his boots crunching on scattered gravel. "Sir, this is a high-crime area. We've had multiple reports of suspicious activity." He paused at the trunk, eyeing it with obvious suspicion. If he only knew about the surveillance equipment hidden inside, carefully documenting every drug deal that went down in that warehouse. "No crime in sitting in my own car," Dan replied, maintaining the perfect balance between respectful and defensive that he'd observed in his years of police work. He knew exactly what these officers were thinking. He'd been in their shoes before, eager to make a difference, sometimes too eager. The officers exchanged glances, the kind that Dan had shared with his own partners countless times. He could practically read their minds. Something wasn't adding up, and they weren't going to let it go. Their training told them to trust their instincts, but tonight those instincts were leading them down a dangerous path. "Step out of the vehicle, sir," Officer Lee commanded, his hand resting on his belt. Dan complied slowly, deliberately, knowing that any sudden movements could escalate the situation. As he stood in the cold night air, he felt the reassuring presence of his real badge in his boot, but revealing it now would destroy everything he'd worked for. The questioning continued, each answer Dan gave seemingly making the officers more suspicious. Yes, he spent a lot of time here. No, he didn't have a permanent address. No, he couldn't explain why he chose this particular spot. Each truthful but vague response added another brick to the wall of suspicion the officers were building. "Pop the trunk, please," Officer Wilson said, not really making it sound like a request. Dan's heart rate picked up. Opening that trunk would reveal everything. The cameras, the notebooks, the evidence. But refusing would only confirm their suspicions. "Got a warrant?" Dan asked, knowing the answer but playing his part. The officers' faces hardened at his response. He'd seen that look before, the moment when officers decide they're done playing nice. "Sir, we have probable cause to believe this vehicle is being used in criminal activity," Officer Lee stated, reciting the words like he'd practiced them in the mirror. "We're calling in the K9 unit." Dan watched as Officer Wilson radioed for backup, knowing things were about to get complicated. The K9 unit would definitely alert, not because of drugs, but because of the various pieces of police equipment in his trunk. He'd seen countless drug busts go down from the other side of the badge, but being on this end was an entirely different experience. Within minutes, more patrol cars arrived, their lights painting the street in alternating red and blue. The T9 unit's German Shepherd circled his car, and as Dan predicted, showed interest in the trunk. To the growing crowd of officers, this was all the confirmation they needed. "Based on the K9 alert and your suspicious behavior, we're seizing this vehicle under civil forfeiture laws," Officer Lee announced, clearly proud of what he thought was a major bust. If only they knew they were about to destroy months of careful police work. Dan watched as a tow truck was called, his mind racing through options. He could reveal his identity now, but the warehouse across the street was still active. If word got out that law enforcement had been watching, months of work would evaporate. But letting them take his car meant losing all the evidence he'd gathered. As the tow truck's headlights appeared around the corner, Dan made his decision. He'd maintain his cover a little longer, follow the car to the impound lot, then reveal his identity once they were away from the warehouse. What he didn't know was that Officers Lee and Wilson had already decided this wasn't going to be a normal impound situation. The next phase of this night would prove to be even more unexpected than the first, as a simple misunderstanding was about to turn into one of the most notorious incidents in local law enforcement history. Sometimes the worst mistakes come from the best intentions, and tonight was going to prove that in spectacular fashion. The tow truck's chains rattled against the cold pavement as Dan's Chevrolet was secured for transport. Each metallic clank felt like a clock ticking down to disaster. He stood on the sidewalk, hands in his pockets to hide their trembling, not from fear, but from the effort of restraining himself from reaching for his badge. "You can pick up your personal belongings from the impound office tomorrow," Officer Lee said, scribbling on his notepad. "That is, if you can prove ownership." The young officer's tone carried that mix of authority and satisfaction that only comes from believing you've just made a career-defining bust. What happened next would haunt Dan for months to come. As he watched his car being lifted onto the tow truck, he noticed Officer Wilson speaking quietly into his radio just out of earshot. The officer's body language set off every alarm bell in Dan's veteran instincts. Something wasn't right about this seizure. The small convoy of police vehicles began moving, with Dan's car in the middle. But they weren't heading toward the city impound lot. Instead, they turned north toward the old industrial district. Dan felt his stomach drop. In 15 years as sheriff, he'd never authorized an impound vehicle to be taken to that area. "Where exactly are you taking my car?" Dan asked, maintaining his cover but unable to completely hide the authority in his voice. Officer Lee, who'd been about to step into his patrol car, turned back with a rehearsed smile. "Sir, you're welcome to file a complaint with the department if you have concerns about our procedures," he said, clearly reciting from his training manual. "Would you like a ride to the bus station?" Dan declined the offer, already pulling out his phone to call for a ride from one of his undercover team members. He needed to follow that convoy, but revealing himself now in this location could still compromise everything. As he dialed, he watched his car disappear around a corner, taking 6 months of evidence with it. 20 minutes later, Dan sat in his colleague's unmarked car, following the convoy at a safe distance. His fellow detective, a veteran named Pat, kept shooting worried glances his way. They'd worked together for 10 years, and Pat had never seen the sheriff this tense. "They going to the Burnyard," Pat whispered, recognizing the route. "But that's impossible. Vehicle burns need approval from—" Pat's voice trailed off, remembering who was sitting next to him. The Burnyard was a secure facility where seized drug vehicles were sometimes destroyed, but only after thorough processing and with signed authorization from the sheriff's office, Dan's office. These officers were about to make a mistake that would echo through the department for years to come. As they pulled up to the facility's gate, Dan and Pat watched in disbelief as the guard waved the convoy through without checking paperwork. The young officers must have called ahead, maybe even dropped some names. In their eagerness to prove themselves, they were breaking every procedure in the book. "Boss," Pat said quietly, "maybe it's time to—" "Not yet." Dan cut him off, his eyes fixed on his car as it was backed into position in the Burnyard. "We need to see how far they're willing to take this." The floodlights clicked on, illuminating the yard like a stadium. Dan could see the two young officers gesturing excitedly, pointing at his car while talking to the yard supervisor. Even from this distance, their body language screamed of rookie cops trying to impress their superiors. "They think they've caught a major drug supplier," Dan said, more to himself than to Pat. "They're trying to make a name for themselves." He understood their motivation. He'd been young and ambitious once too. But understanding didn't make watching this unfold any easier. The yard supervisor approached the car with a flashlight, giving it a cursory inspection. Dan's fingers dug into the dashboard as he watched the man circle his vehicle. Any proper inspection would reveal the surveillance equipment, the cameras, the carefully documented evidence. But the supervisor was already walking away, giving a thumbs up to the officers. "They're not even going to process it," Pat said in disbelief. "Boss, this is way beyond procedure. We need to stop this now." But Dan remained frozen in place, watching as the yard crew began their preparations. He knew that stopping them now would mean revealing his operation in front of too many witnesses. Word would spread, and months of work would evaporate. Yet letting them destroy his car meant losing all the evidence he'd gathered. The sound of gas cans being opened carried across the yard. The young officers stood back, arms crossed, watching with satisfaction as the yard crew worked. They thought they were sending a message to the local drug trade. Instead, they were about to become a cautionary tale taught in every police academy in the state. "Last chance, boss," Pat warned, reaching for his radio. "Once they light it up." Dan held up his hand, silencing his colleague. His mind raced through scenarios, calculating risks and consequences. The warehouse surveillance could continue with new equipment, new evidence could be gathered, but if his cover was blown now, the entire operation would collapse. The first match struck, its small flame a pinprick in the darkness. In that moment, Dan made his decision. Sometimes being a good cop meant letting others make their mistakes, even when those mistakes cost you dearly. As the flames began to spread across his car's hood, he knew the real confrontation was yet to come. The night was about to take its most dramatic turn yet, as years of experience and youthful overconfidence were about to collide in a way that would change everyone involved. The fire grown in the barnyard was nothing compared to the storm that was about to break over the Pine Creek Police Department. The flames danced higher into the night sky, consuming Dan's Chevrolet with frightening efficiency. 6 months of work, countless hours of surveillance footage, and detailed evidence logs, all of it turning to ash before his eyes. The young officers stood nearby, their faces lit by the orange glow, looking pleased with themselves. "That's what you get for dealing in our town," Officer Lee muttered, just loud enough for Dan to hear. The comment made Dan's jaw clench. These officers thought they were sending a message to criminals, but instead they were about to learn a harsh lesson about jumping to conclusions. Pat shifted uncomfortably beside him. "Boss, they're destroying evidence of at least 12 major drug deals, not to mention about $50,000 worth of department surveillance equipment." The heat from the fire reached them even at this distance. Dan watched as his car's windows shattered from the intensity, each pop like a countdown to what was about to happen. The trunk lid, warped by the heat, suddenly sprung open, revealing glimpses of the equipment inside before the flames consumed it. Officer Wilson noticed it first. His satisfied smirk faltered as he caught sight of something distinctly undrug-like in the burning trunk. "Hey, what's that?" he asked, stepping closer to the inferno. "Is that?" "A camera." The yard supervisor grabbed his arm, pulling him back from the heat. "Too late now, kid. Whatever it was, it's evidence now. Hope you did all your paperwork right." Those words seemed to hit Officer Wilson like a bucket of cold water. His partner, still riding high on their perceived victory, hadn't noticed his change in demeanor. "This'll make the captain happy," Officer Lee said, already imagining the commendation he'd receive. "Quick and clean operation, no complications." Dan felt the weight of his badge in his boot, pressing against his ankle like a ticking bomb. He'd seen enough. These young officers had just destroyed months of police work and thousands of dollars of equipment without proper authorization. It was time to end this. "Pat," he said quietly, "call the captain. Tell him to get down here right now." His colleague nodded, already dialing. Dan straightened his posture, letting years of authority settle back into his bearing as he walked toward the group. The yard supervisor noticed the change first. Something about the way this supposed vagrant carried himself suddenly seemed different. The supervisor had seen enough law enforcement officers in his career to recognize that walk. This was someone used to being in charge. Dan approached the young officers, who were still watching their handiwork with satisfaction. "Officer Lee," he said, his voice carrying the weight of 15 years of command. "I believe you owe me an explanation." The young officer turned, annoyance flickering across his face. "Sir, I told you if you have a complaint, you can." His voice trailed off as he registered the change in Dan's demeanor. "You know," Dan continued, reaching down to his boot, "there are procedures for vehicle seizures." His fingers wrapped around his badge. "Procedures that require proper documentation." He straightened up, holding his shield where the firelight caught it. "Procedures that require the sheriff's approval." The color drained from both officers' faces as the gold badge glinted in the firelight. Officer Wilson actually stumbled backward, nearly tripping over his own feet. Officer Lee's mouth opened and closed several times, but no words came out. "Sheriff's Department, Pine Creek County," Dan said, letting each word land like a hammer blow. "And you just burned about 6 months of undercover work investigating the biggest drug operation in the state." The yard supervisor swore under his breath and quickly retreated to his office. The young officers stood frozen, their earlier confidence evaporating like morning dew. In the distance, sirens announced the approach of more police vehicles. The captain was on his way. "Aren't we?" "But you were," Officer Lee stammered, his face growing paler by the second. Behind him, the Chevrolet continued to burn, a fitting backdrop to the career immolation happening in front of it. "You know what the really interesting part is?" Dan continued, his voice deadly calm. "Not once did either of you run the vehicle's plates. Not once did you check for proper authorization for a burn. Not once did you stop to think that maybe, just maybe, there might be more to the situation than what you assumed." The roar of approaching vehicles grew louder. Pat stepped up beside Dan, no longer hiding his own badge. "Captain's 2 minutes out, boss," along with Internal Affairs. Officer Wilson looked like he might be sick. "Internal Affairs? But we were just trying to make a name for yourselves?" Dan finished for him. "Well, congratulations, you certainly did that, though probably not in the way you hoped." The fire behind them began to die down, having consumed nearly everything in and on the car. Dan watched as years of experience and evidence disappeared into the night sky as smoke. But maybe, he thought, this disaster would serve a greater purpose, teaching these young officers a lesson they'd never forget. The first of the arriving vehicles pulled into the yard, emergency lights painting everything in red and blue. What had started as a routine night was about to become a defining moment in these young officers' careers, though not in the way they planned. Sometimes the hardest lessons are the ones we learn through our biggest mistakes. The arrival of Captain Brooks brought a new kind of tension to the boneyard. The seasoned police veteran took in the scene before him. The smoldering remains of an unmarked police vehicle, 2 shell-shocked young officers, and his undercover sheriff standing amid the chaos, still wearing his vagrant disguise. "Somebody better start explaining," the captain said, his voice carrying the weight of 30 years on the force. "And it better be good." The yard fell silent except for the crackling of dying embers and the soft whir of police radios. Officer Lee, who'd been so confident just an hour ago, now looked like a rookie on his first day. Officer Wilson kept staring at the ground, as if hoping it would open up and swallow him whole. "These officers," Dan began, his calm voice somehow more threatening than any shout, decided to conduct an unauthorized vehicle seizure and destruction, without running the plates, without proper documentation, and without. He paused for effect, checking with the sheriff's office. The captain's face darkened as he understood the implications. "The surveillance operation? The one we've been working on for 6 months." Up in smoke, Dan confirmed, gesturing to his destroyed car. "Along with about $50,000 worth of department equipment and evidence that could have brought down the entire Carter Street drug ring." Officer Lee finally found his voice, though it came out shaky. "Sir, we had no way of knowing." "That's exactly the point," the captain cut him off. "You had every way of knowing. Running plates is basic procedure. Proper documentation for seizures is basic procedure. Getting authorization for destruction is basic procedure." Each mention of basic procedure made the young officers flinch. 2 Internal Affairs investigators moved through the scene, taking photos and notes. Their presence made everyone uneasy. In law enforcement, an IR investigation could end careers faster than any criminal. "The surveillance equipment in the trunk," one investigator called out, examining the charred remains. "High-end stuff. Night vision capabilities, digital recording, all destroyed." Dan watched the young officers' faces as the reality of what they'd done sank in deeper with each revelation. He remembered his own early days on the force, the eagerness to prove himself, the desire to make a difference. But he'd had good mentors who taught him to think before acting. "You know what the worst part is?" Dan said, addressing the young officers. "I understand why you did it. You saw something suspicious, you wanted to act decisively, make a difference. But being a good cop isn't about being the fastest to act, it's about being thorough, careful, and always following procedure." The captain nodded in agreement. Those procedures exist for exactly this reason, to prevent mistakes that can't be undone. A cool breeze swept through the yard, carrying the acrid smell of burnt rubber and melted electronics. The fire crew had arrived to ensure the blaze was completely out, their presence adding to the circus-like atmosphere of the scene. "What happens now?" Officer Wilson asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The captain exchanged looks with Dan before answering. That's up to internal affairs and the sheriff. But I can tell you this, both of you are looking at serious disciplinary action. The department doesn't take the destruction of evidence and equipment lightly. Dan stepped closer to the young officers, his voice softening slightly. You wanted to send a message tonight. Well, you did, just not the one you intended. This incident will be taught in the academy for years to come as an example of why we follow procedures, why we check and double-check before acting. The sound of more vehicles approaching drew everyone's attention. The police chief had arrived, along with several senior officers. News traveled fast in law enforcement, and this was the kind of incident that would have phones ringing all the way up the chain of command. 6 months of work, Dan said, more to himself than anyone else. Dozens of dealers, hundreds of transactions, all documented. Evidence that could have cleaned up this town. He looked at the young officers. And now we'd have to start over from scratch. Officer Lee straightened his shoulders, trying to salvage some dignity. Sir, if there's any way we can help fix this. Oh, you'll help all right, Dan replied. Once the disciplinary board makes its decision, assuming you still have your badges, you'll both be assisting with the new surveillance operation. From the paperwork side, every form, every request, every procedure, you'll learn them all inside and out. The chief approached the group, his face a mask of controlled anger. The night was far from over, and there would be consequences to face. But as Dan watched the young officers standing at attention, facing the music for their actions, he saw something that gave him hope, the look of officers who had learned a lesson they'd never forget. Sometimes the most expensive lessons are the ones that stick with us the longest. Tonight's lesson had cost the department time, money, and resources, but if it prevented similar mistakes in the future, maybe some good would come from it after all. The next few weeks at the Pine Creek Police Department felt like walking on eggshells. Word of the Burnyard incident spread through the force like wildfire, becoming the talk of every shift change and coffee break. Officers kept glancing at Dan's office, where internal affairs investigators came and went like bees around a hive. The paperwork alone is giving me headaches, the captain said during one morning briefing, rubbing his temples. Insurance claims, equipment loss reports, operation compromise assessments, and that's just the start. The young officers, Lee and Wilson, had been temporarily reassigned to desk duty pending their disciplinary hearing. They spent their days buried in procedure manuals and departmental guidelines, their earlier cockiness replaced by a quiet determination to learn from their mistake. One morning, Dan found Officer Lee alone in the records room, surrounded by stacks of papers. The young officer jumped to attention when he noticed the sheriff's presence. Sir, I've been reviewing all the vehicle seizure cases from the past 5 years, Lee said, gesturing to the files around him. I found 17 instances where proper procedures weren't completely followed. Nothing as bad as what we did, but still. Dan picked up one of the files, noting the detailed annotations in Lee's handwriting. And what have you learned from this research, officer? That shortcuts become habits, Lee replied, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd learned a hard lesson. And habits can destroy careers, or worse, compromise justice. The department's response to the incident went beyond just disciplining 2 officers. Dan had initiated a complete overhaul of training procedures, using the Burnyard incident as a catalyst for change. Every officer, regardless of rank or experience, would now undergo regular refresher training on proper procedures. We're installing new safeguards, Dan explained to his command staff during a strategy meeting. No vehicle seizure or destruction can proceed without triple verification. We're implementing a new digital checklist system. And most importantly, we're changing how we train our officers to think. The drug surveillance operation had to be rebuilt from scratch, but this time with some unexpected help. Officers Lee and Wilson, their disciplinary hearing complete and their positions reduced to probationary status, threw themselves into supporting the new operation from the paperwork side, as promised. I never knew how much planning went into these operations, Wilson admitted one evening, organizing surveillance schedules. All those nights we saw your car, we thought we were being clever. But you had backup teams, response plans, everything calculated down to the minute. The incident became a teaching tool at the police academy, though not quite in the way the young officers had originally hoped. Instead of being an example of decisive action, it became a lesson in the importance of thorough police work and following proper procedures. "You know what still keeps me up at night?" Lee confided to his partner during a late shift of filing paperwork. "Not the disciplinary action, not the demotion, not even the chief's disappointment. It's thinking about what could have happened if that had been a different kind of operation. If lives had been at stake instead of just evidence." The drug ring they'd been investigating didn't escape either. With the original evidence destroyed, Dan had to build a new case from the ground up. But this time, he had the entire department working like a well-oiled machine, with every officer acutely aware of the importance of proper procedure. "Sometimes good things come from mistakes," Dan told his officers during a department meeting. "This incident forced us to look at how we operate, to question our assumptions, to become better at what we do. It's not about never making mistakes. It's about learning from them and making sure they don't happen again." The young officer's story became something of a legend in the department, though not in the way they'd originally hoped. Instead of being known for making a big bust, they became known for something more valuable, admitting their mistake and working tirelessly to make things right. One day, about 2 months after the incident, Dan found a detailed proposal on his desk from Officers Lee and Wilson. They had developed a comprehensive training program for junior officers, focusing on the importance of thorough investigation and proper procedure, using their own experience as a case study. "We can't undo what we did," their note read, "but maybe we can prevent others from making the same mistake." Sometimes the best teachers are the ones who learned their lessons the hard way. Looking out over his department, Dan could see the changes taking hold. Officers double-checking their procedures, veterans mentoring rookies with renewed attention to detail, and a new culture of thoroughness replacing the old rush to action. The Burnyard incident had cost the department time, money, and resources. But the lessons learned, about procedure, about assumptions, about the importance of doing things right, those were proving to be invaluable. Sometimes the most expensive mistakes turn into the most valuable teaching moments. 1 year after the Burnyard incident, the Pine Creek Police Department gathered for their annual awards ceremony. The atmosphere was different from previous years. There was a new sense of pride in the air, not from big arrests or dramatic busts, but from something more fundamental, doing things right. Dan stood at the podium, looking out over his officers. The past year had brought more changes than anyone could have predicted that fiery night at the Burnyard. "Law enforcement isn't about being heroes," he began his speech. "It's about being thorough, being careful, and most importantly, being willing to learn from our mistakes." In the audience, Officers Lee and Wilson sat in their dress uniforms, their probationary status recently lifted. Their faces showed none of the brash confidence they'd had a year ago. Instead, there was something more valuable, wisdom earned through experience. "Our department has set new standards for procedure and training," Dan continued. "In the past year, we've had 0 unauthorized seizures, 0 compromised operations, and the highest rate of successful prosecutions in our department's history. And it all started because of a mistake that could have destroyed careers." The drug ring they'd been investigating that night had finally been brought down, though it had taken months longer than originally planned. The new case, built methodically and by the book, had proved even stronger than the original would have been. "The evidence we gathered the second time around was bulletproof," the district attorney had said during the trial. "Every I dotted, every T crossed. This is how you build a case that sticks." After the ceremony, Dan found Lee and Wilson in the evidence room, where they still spent much of their time. But now they weren't there as punishment. They'd become the department's go-to officers for procedure and documentation training. "Teaching the new recruits again tomorrow?" Dan asked, though he already knew the answer. The 2 officers had turned their experience into a powerful teaching tool, sharing their story with every new class of officers. "Yes, sir," Lee replied, organizing a stack of training materials. "We're adding a new section about conducting thorough background checks before any operation. The cadets seem to really pay attention when we tell them about that night." Wilson nodded in agreement. Nothing gets the point across like a real-life example, especially when the people teaching made the mistake themselves. The changes hadn't stopped at Pine Creek. Other departments across the state had adopted their new procedures and training programs. The Burnyard incident, as it came to be known, had become a case study in police academies throughout the region. You know what the best part is? The captain commented during a staff meeting. Other departments are learning from our mistake without having to make it themselves. That's how progress happens. The young officers had transformed too. Gone was the need to prove themselves with dramatic busts. Instead, they'd found pride in being thorough, in doing things right, in helping others learn from their experience. I used to think being a good cop was about big moments, Lee reflected one quiet evening. Now I know it's about all the small moments, double-checking procedures, following protocols, making sure everything is done right. The department had created a new position, Procedural Oversight Officer. It was offered to both Lee and Wilson, who would share the role, using their hard-earned experience to prevent similar mistakes from happening again. Sometimes life's best lessons come wrapped in our biggest mistakes, Dan told them when offering the position. What matters isn't that you made the mistake, it's what you did afterward. The Burnyard itself had changed too. New procedures required multiple levels of authorization for any vehicle destruction. A memorial plaque had been installed, reading simply, "Remember procedure, prevent regret." During their training sessions, Lee and Wilson always ended with the same message. We thought we were going to be heroes that night. Instead, we learned something more important, that real police work isn't about heroics. It's about being thorough, being careful, and always following procedure. The final cost report for that night's mistake had been substantial: one undercover vehicle, $50,000 in surveillance equipment, 6 months of lost work, and countless hours of administrative oversight. But the benefits? A stronger department, better trained officers, and improved procedures had proved priceless. Looking back, Dan would later say, that night could have ended careers. Instead, it launched a new chapter in our department's history. Sometimes the best success stories start with failure. It's what you learn from it that matters. The Pine Creek Police Department had emerged stronger, wiser, and more professional. The Burnyard incident had become more than just a cautionary tale. It was proof that even the biggest mistakes could lead to positive change if people were willing to learn from them.